To understand is to forgive.
Punishing people when they do something wrong
I don't want to understand.
feels really good.
It's a much better world in all those places.
Every mistake is due to a systems failure.
What motivates someone to engage in this kind of horror?
That we have subtracted a perception of free will out
I want him punished.
where there is none.
The Industrial Revolution. What a great time for innovations and the growth of the gross domestic product, from the steam engine and the internal combustion engine to the power to harness electricity. The Industrial Revolution provided huge improvements in standard of living for those working outside the factories. For those working inside the factories, however, it wasn't such a great time for their fingers, their arms, their legs, and health in general. That is because they worked very long hours, and the machinery that the workers were working with was treacherous. Take a look at this drawing of an old machine. There are no guards, every single gears are exposed, and the same thing for this machine. The belt and the blade are exposed, leaving at risk distracted fingers. These working conditions led to the amount of injuries per 1 million hours worked in industries like steel to be 80.8 in 1907. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything before that, but I imagine it was worse. To put it into perspective, today in the steel sector, this is the amount of injuries per million hours worked that I found from a company called AM Industries. In 2019, they had less than 1 injury per million hour worked. So how do we go from 80.8 to 1 injury per million hour worked in 110 years? One of the main reasons is because we changed the way we thought about injuries. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and I assume before that, if you injured yourself, it was your fault. If you put your hand on the exposed saw blade, it was you that shouldn't have put your hand there. Sometimes the employer was asked to pay compensation, but most of the time, if you showed any kind of negligence, or if the cause of the accident was because of another worker, the employer was off the hook and didn't have to pay anything. That all changed at the end of the 19th century when social movements started protesting for workplace reforms. Eventually, governments across the developed world gave in. It started slow, then it sped up. For instance, in 1888, Canada passed the Factory Act. It regulated a number of things, one of them being capping the number of hours that a child can work to 10 hours a day and 60 hours a week. Very progressive, I know. On a side note, I wonder what people who wrote those bills thought at the time. Yes, a child working more than 60 hours a week is exploitation. I recommend that a child only work 55 hours a week so that he can have time to eat, sleep, and perhaps learn how to count to 10. Eventually, most first world countries changed their liability law and created a no-fault system. Germany made the change in 1884, Britain in 1897, and the US during the 1910s. How it worked and how it still works is that the employer pays a kind of workplace injury insurance, and every time a worker gets injured, the worker gets automatic compensation from the insurance. This system completely shifted the blame for injuries from the worker to the employer, but it caused some issues for employers because every time an employee would get injured, the employer's insurance premiums would go up. This led factories to hire safety engineers and completely changed their way of thinking about accidents. Accidents didn't happen because the employees chose to hurt themselves on purpose. No, the accidents happened because their workplace environment allowed them to make those bad choices. If there's no way for a worker to put his hand in between two gears, he won't put his hand in between two gears. The factories then started putting guards on every exposed gear, belt, blade, and electric circuit. This change of mentality dramatically reduced the amount of workplace injuries, and the reduction happened fairly quickly. In only 30 years, steel injuries went down by 88%, cement 96%, paper 96%, and DuPont chemicals went down by 96%. This story is one that repeated itself multiple times throughout the 20th and 21st century. There seems to be a trend that every time that we stop blaming the individual for their mistakes and assume that their actions are highly determined by their environment, things just seem to get better. Everyone makes less mistakes, there's fewer deaths, and society just becomes more humane. So this will be the subject that we will explore in this video.
Injuries caused by errors and mistakes are not caused by bad people, but by bad systems.
This is Lucian Leap. He was a professor at Harvard School of Public Health, and what he's most known for is trying to reduce medical errors and improve medical systems. His main thesis is that errors are caused by bad systems, not bad people.
When you or I make a mistake, it's not because we're careless or don't know what we're doing or so forth. It's because the system has set us up to do something wrong and we fell into a trap.
In this interview, Lucian Lieb talks about an example of nurses injecting by mistake patients with potassium chloride instead of sodium chloride. The vials are very similar, but injecting potassium chloride stops the heart and can be fatal.
Nobody ever injects potassium chloride on purpose, but all the nurse has to do is mix up 2 vials thinking it's sodium chloride when it's potassium chloride, looks the same, fills the syringe, injects it in, it's all over.
Now, there are 2 ways to stop this problem. The first way is that you can blame the nurse and say, that's your fault, and fire her so that she never makes that mistake again. Or you can just remove the potassium chloride from the nurse's tray.
We don't need to have it available. We don't ever inject it directly. We put it in intravenous solutions. The pharmacist can do that.
Since there's no situation where a nurse would need to inject it anyway, why have it there at all in the first place? The first approach is the bad people mentality, which hasn't been very effective, and the second is the bad system mentality. The problem in believing that there are bad people who are responsible for their mistakes is that it removes the curiosity behind problem solving, and it hinders on our ability to collect the most important thing for problem solving: data. Data is really important because if you don't know that an error happened the day it happened, it prevents problem solvers from figuring out the root cause of the problem. Also, physicians and nurses are not incentivized to report their mistake if they know they're going to be reprimanded for it. There's sometimes this belief in the medical community that good physicians do not make mistakes, and so for a physician, admitting that they've made a mistake would threaten their ego and reputation towards their colleagues.
When a physician does something that seems awful, if we indeed can get him or her to believe and understand that it wasn't just their fault, that it was a bad system, that helps lift some of the burden of guilt from their shoulders. It also means they can begin to look at it in a constructive way and say, okay, now how do we redesign that system so somebody else doesn't do the same thing 2 weeks from now?
Focusing on bad systems encourages physicians and nurses to admit their mistakes and share with other hospitals what led to those errors, ensuring they don't happen again. Thankfully, more hospitals are starting to shift their culture, focusing on systems instead of blaming individuals. The same cultural change happened with airplanes. From 2018 to 2022, there was only 1 fatality per 13.7 million passengers boarding on commercial flights worldwide, making air travel one of the safest way to travel. Your chances of dying in a plane crash is 1 in 11 million. Guess what it is for cars? Take your time. Got your guess? Okay, so the chances of dying in a car crash is 1 in 5,000. Quite the difference, to say the least. But air travel didn't used to be this safe. As you can see, from 1968 to 1977, there was 1 fatality per 350,000 passengers. Part of the improvement comes from advancements in airplane technology, but another key reason is that airlines stopped blaming their controllers. From the beginning of commercial flights up to the mid-1990s, air traffic controllers, the people responsible for the safe, orderly, and expeditious flow of air traffic in the global air traffic control system, were usually severely blamed for their mistakes. And to be honest, it's easy to understand why. If you were responsible for the death of 200 people because you were inattentive, I would also want to blame you and make you lose your job for what you've done, especially if I'm from the family of one of the deceased. But this created a culture where controllers hid their mistakes or tried to shift the blame onto others, making it impossible to find the root cause of crashes or near misses. This was a huge problem because if you cannot find the root cause, you cannot effectively solve the problem. And if you cannot solve the problem, well, planes keep crashing and people keep dying. So, while blaming controllers might feel justified and good, safety engineers faced a critical decision. They could keep blaming individuals, creating a culture of fear where no one admitted their errors, or they could suppress the urge to point fingers and instead encourage transparency. By fostering openness, they could gather the data needed to uncover and address systemic issues, ultimately making air travel safer for everyone. And that's why, in 1997, the Commercial Aviation Safety Team adopted a systems approach to airline safety. Instead of blaming individual controllers for errors, they shifted the focus to the air traffic control system itself. They even started rewarding controllers for reporting their mistakes and sharing solutions to prevent future errors. This allowed airlines to gather valuable data and address recurring issues. From the start of this program in 1997 to 2008, the Commercial Aviation Safety Team reduced fatality risk on commercial flights by an impressive 83%. The challenge with changing this type of culture is that punishing people when they do something wrong feels really good. Punishing those who have done wrong triggers the same dopamine circuitry activated by orgasms and cocaine. That's why
How about another joke, Moran?
when you read the news, watch a video or a movie where the bad guy gets
Get what you fucking deserve!
it makes you feel good. It's something we evolved to do, and it probably was a very good strategy 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago to keep everyone in check. The problem with strategies evolved through standard evolution is that Mother Nature uses the path of least resistance. In other words, as long as it's a good enough strategy, evolution will steer us in that direction. But here's the thing, we have moved far beyond simply trying to survive another day. In developed countries, we have gotten used to a standard of living that is so absurdly high that the problems we are trying to solve today cannot be put in the same category. We went from how do I survive another day, or how can I find a reliable source of food, or how do I make sure that my cow doesn't get stolen, to a problem like how can I make sure that the physicians in my hospital doesn't succumb to cognitive biases and failed heuristics when diagnosing a patient? To solve our modern problems, we probably need to put punishment and blame aside and focus on systems. And it seems to be working for factories, medicine, and aviation. So what other areas should we extend this thinking to? Well, the idea for this video came to me after watching an episode of the Within Reason podcast by Alex O'Connor featuring Robert Sapolsky. During the episode, Sapolsky talks about how we don't have free will, and every time we realize that we have less control than we think over our actions, the world gets better.
It's a much better world that we don't burn people at the stake now when the weather turns bad. It's a much better world that we figured out about 2 centuries ago that an epileptic seizure is a neurological disorder. It's not a sign that somebody is demonically possessed. It's a much better world that in the last 40 years or so we figured out that, say, schizophrenia, rather than it is caused by psychodynamically toxic mothers who secretly hated their child and made them schizophrenic. It's a great thing we figured out that, like, some kids have trouble learning to read, not because they're lazy or unsmart, but they have like architectural abnormalities in one part of their cortex and they tend to reverse letters. They have dyslexia. It's a much better world in all those places that we have subtracted a perception of free will out where there is none.
So one area that we should extend this no blame, no punishment logic is in understanding disorders and illnesses. Instead of saying like, oh, he's acting like that because he has a relationship with Satan, or he's lazy, or he's unmotivated, we should try to figure out what exactly is causing the behavior. If, for example, you blame a child for not trying hard enough when reading, you're not actually trying to solve the problem. Telling them to just try harder or focus more isn't helpful. That child might have a condition like dyslexia, literally like making it harder to read, or ADHD, and he might require different learning strategies. Now, what about criminals? Should we apply the same logic that I talked about to the justice system? Instead of blaming criminals for their actions, should we focus on blaming the system they're living in instead? Well, here's what this mentality would probably look like in practice. In 2011, Anders Breivik carried out the largest terrorist attack in Norwegian history, killing 69 teenagers. He was given 21 years in prison, and one survivor appraised the trial by saying if he, Breivik, is deemed not to be dangerous anymore after 21 years, then he should be released. Also, the mayor of Oslo wrote to him saying, "It is my job to see that no one experiences the same social rejection that you did. Your fight against social rejection is the only fight we have in common, Anders." As you can see, even for atrocities, Norway focuses more on the environment that contributed to the crime and rehabilitation rather than on individual accountability. Depending on the culture of the country you live in, this approach may either feel completely normal and justified or seem like they're just being too soft on crime. As I was editing this video, I was trying to find clips and articles about Anders Breivik, and the more I read about him, the more I think like, Jesus Christ, Anders, can you be any more psychopathic than what you're doing right now? Because if you go on YouTube and you type Anders Breivik, you'll see, for example, a video 12 years ago, Anders Breivik, I regret not killing more people. Or 8 years ago, Anders Breivik returns to court with a Nazi salute. Or even 2 years ago, mass murderer Anders Breivik asked Norway court for parole, but in that video, he's like holding something that says stop white genocide, and he's still like throwing the Nazi salute.
Today I renounce all forms of violence and terror, along with the objectives in the manifesto, and I give you my word of honour that this is behind me forever. But this doesn't mean that I won't keep fighting for a national socialist takeover of Norway and the West.
And so what's interesting about a system like the Norwegian justice system is that you need to be ready to have people like Anders Breivik that will push your system, your humanity, to its limit. You will have people that will make you say, okay, let's just make one exception just for him, right? But you cannot do that. If you want to stay true to your values and you want to stay true to like rehabilitation and human rights, you need to maintain that everyone, even Anders, deserves to have his human rights upheld, right? And I think from what I've seen, the Norwegian are doing it well. For example, if I read the full quote of the survivor, he says, if he, Breivik, is deemed not to be dangerous anymore after 21 years, then he should be released. That's how it should work. That's staying true to our principles and the best evidence that he hasn't changed our society. Also, the way the Norwegian justice system works is even after you serve your full sentence, you can still be kept in prison if you're still deemed to be too dangerous. So there's like the 21 years is a suggestion, let's just say. So he could very well stay in there his whole life, or if he's deemed not to be dangerous, he could get out before 21 years, depending on how he behaves. So yeah, quite a troubled man, you know? Let's get back to the video. Now, just for fun, let's compare Norway's response to Breivik's crimes with how people in the United States react when someone commits heinous acts. On January 24th, 1989, in the US, crowds were cheering, singing, "Dead Bundy is dead!" and even selling t-shirts that said, "Burn Bundy Burn," outside the jail where serial killer Ted Bundy was being executed. I suspect that if Bundy would have gotten the same sentence that Breivik got, Americans would have risen up in arms and started using their Second Amendment rights to make sure that Bundy would not get out of this alive. The difficulty with taking the logic that I've discussed in this video and applying it to criminals is just that it feels wrong. When you see someone steal someone else's property, when you see gang members committing gratuitous violence, and when you see man raping women, it doesn't make it really enticing to talk about the rights of those criminals and how we should treat them as if they're not responsible for their actions. This feeling is so innate in us that some people will take advantage of it to get the support of the populace. They will try to maintain that anger by not talking about what possibly caused this criminal to commit a crime, because the more you understand, the less you seem to judge. For example, UK Prime Minister John Major said in an interview with the Daily Mail in 1993, society needs to condemn a little more and understand a little less. Here's another one from New York Mayor Ed Koch talking about the Central Park Five.
To understand is to forgive. I don't want to understand what motivates someone to engage in this kind of horror. I want, rather than to understand him, I want him punished.
So, what are your thoughts? Should we condemn more than we understand or understand more than we condemn? Let me know in the comments down below, because this will be a topic for a future video. The video will probably be titled, "Should we treat crimes like diseases?" So now, if you want to see it, make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.